I'm Andy Otto, and I'm on the pastoral team at Ignatius House. The other day, I was watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood with my daughter Eva, and Mr. Rogers was visiting a grocery store to show his viewers how a grocery store worked. What struck me was how many people there he seemed to know. He greeted someone outside the store he knew, and inside he said hello to another woman. And then he seemed to know the people working there at the store, and he greeted each of them by name. I certainly recognize the same faces each time I go to the store, but I certainly can't tell you their names. But to Mr. Rogers, these essential workers were not just faceless servants. They were real people who were part of his neighborhood, a neighborhood of people who cared for and served one another. And each time Mr. Rogers greeted one of these workers at the store, he gestured toward the camera and said to them, "I'd like you to know my television neighbor." He didn't say, "I'd like you to meet my neighbor." He said, "I'd like you to know my neighbor." I was moved by this. Fred Rogers didn't just see people as strangers. He saw them as friends, as human beings with names and lives and dreams. His hope was for his neighbors to truly know one another. In the scriptures, we encounter the Greek word ginosko, which means to know through experience rather than intelligence. It's how we ought to relate to Jesus, but we sometimes know things about Jesus than actually know Jesus as a friend. And Jesus preaches about this kind of intimate neighborliness in his story of the Good Samaritan. What initiates Jesus' telling of this story is a lawyer asking him, "Who is my neighbor?" In other words, I'm supposed to love my neighbor, so then how do you define neighbor? What are the exceptions? Lawyers like to look for loopholes, right? So Jesus shows him, by way of the story of the Samaritan, that there is really no one who is not our neighbor. And knowing about your neighbor is not good enough. Mr. Rogers' neighborhood in some ways represented the kingdom of God, where neighbors took the time to know one another, care for one another, look out for one another. Race, gender, age, or origin did not determine your belovedness. Each member of the community belonged to one another. In his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis speaks about not just fraternity, but about authentic friendship, a friendship that expands our hearts toward others. The local neighborhood ought to be a training ground for our global neighborhood. Now, having a child has been helpful for our family to get to know our literal neighbors. We've baked cookies for them, and our daughter Eva has delightfully delivered them with a hand-drawn picture. There's one old lady in our neighborhood who sends Eva thank you postcards, and even sewed an apron for her. And when a new family moved into the neighborhood, we made a point to go and welcome them. During the pandemic, neighbors checked in with one another and asked how they were. And we've seen that human institutions and governments, which exist to serve the common good, have forgotten about this. We have forgotten how to be neighbors. We have forgotten that we belong to one another, as Mother Teresa said. We can too often treat our neighbors not just as strangers, but as an inconvenience. It's a hassle to send aid to a poor country or feed someone who's lost a job. In his recent book, Let Us Dream, Pope Francis writes, "We need a movement of people who know we need each other, who have a sense of responsibility to others and to the world." That's just what I sense in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, and a little bit in my own. Let us not ask, "Who is my neighbor?" as a way to find a way out of caring for the other. Let us ask that question so we can discover how we can better serve the larger neighborhood of the kingdom of God and all our sisters and brothers within it.